She arrived on a Wednesday. That is how Eli Harding would remember it, years later. Not the month, not the exact date, but the day of the week, as though the plainness of it somehow mattered. A Wednesday in the last week of September 1862. And the wagon that carried her into Oregon City rolled in just after the noon bell, its canvas gray with the particular dust of the Blue Mountains, which clings to everything it touches and does not easily let go. He had told himself he would not arrive early. He arrived at 10 o'clock. He stood outside Abernethy's general store with his hat in both hands and watched the eastern road with the careful stillness of a man who has spent 3 years learning to live without anyone to come home to. He was 34 years old. He had buried a wife and an infant son in the Willamette Valley in the spring of 1859, and he had kept the farm going through 2 more harvests by virtue of stubbornness and the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that eventually passes for purpose. He had written the advertisement himself in November of 1861, sitting at the kitchen table by lamplight with a second cup of coffee gone cold beside him. He had written 4 drafts. The final one said, "Widower, 34, with land and a sound house in the Willamette Valley seeks a wife of good character, willing to work, unafraid of distance. Correspondence welcomed." He had not known what he expected in reply. He received 11 letters. Clara Marsh's had been the 3rd, and he had read it 4 times before setting it down. She wrote plainly, without flourish. She was 26, from a town called Millbrook, Ohio, the second of 5 daughters of a Methodist minister. She had kept house for her father since her mother passed in 1858. She knew how to put up preserves and keep a kitchen garden, and she had some schooling, though she did not dwell on it. She said she was not afraid of hard work and that she had always wanted to see Oregon. That last line, he had thought, was either the most honest thing in the letter or a small attempt to make the proposition sound like something other than what it was. He wrote back the same week. They exchanged 7 letters over the winter of 1861 into 1862. He described the farm, 40 acres in the valley, a house with 2 rooms and a porch that faced west, a creek that ran reliable from March through August. She described Ohio winters and the particular silence of a house with 5 daughters once 4 of them had married and left. She was careful in her letters, precise. She did not promise things she did not know if she could give. In March, she wrote that she had arranged to join a wagon company departing Independence, Missouri on the 15th of April. She would arrive, God willing, in late September. He wrote back immediately, "I will be there." He had not expected to feel anything standing outside Abernethy's store. He was a practical man. He had made a practical arrangement, and then the wagon came around the bend in the road, and the woman on the bench beside the driver turned her face toward him, and his practical arrangement became something else entirely. Something he would not have a name for until much later. He saw her face first. Dark hair pulled back under a bonnet that had seen better weeks, a face that had been pretty once and still was, but had been rearranged by something, not age, not illness, but the particular look of a person who has held themselves together through an extended act of will. Then his eyes moved, the way eyes will, and he understood. She was 7 months along at least. Maybe more. He stood very still. The wagon slowed. Clara Marsh climbed down from the bench with one hand braced against the sideboard and the other pressed briefly to the small of her back. And she straightened, and she looked at him, and she said nothing. Neither did he. That was how it began. Clara had known since before she left Ohio that she would not tell him in a letter. She had turned it over for the entire month of March. Every night, in the small bedroom at the back of her father's house while the last of the Ohio winter pressed against the window glass. She had drafted the letter twice. Both times she had folded the paper and put it in the drawer and not sent it. It was not deception, she told herself. Or it was deception, but it was the kind that had a reason beneath it, and she had spent enough time in her father's church to know that a reason beneath a wrong thing does not make it a right thing, but it does make it a human thing. The reason was this. She had nowhere else to go. The child's father had been a young man named George Alderman, the son of a dry goods merchant 2 towns over. They had known each other 3 years. They had planned to marry in the autumn of 1861, In June of that year, 3 weeks after he enlisted with the 23rd Ohio Infantry, he had written her a letter saying that he thought it best they release each other from their understanding, as the war was uncertain and he did not want her to wait for something that might not come back. She received this letter in July, at which point she had already known for 6 weeks that she was carrying his child. She had not written back. There was nothing to write. Her father had been kind about it, in the way of men who feel things deeply and are constitutionally incapable of saying so directly. He had not turned her out. He had not preached at her. He had sat at the kitchen table for a long time without speaking, and then he had said, quietly, "We will think of something." She had loved him more in that moment than she had words for. What they thought of was Oregon. One of her father's congregants had shown him Eli Harding's advertisement, clipped from a paper. Her father had said nothing about it for 2 days, and then he had set it on the kitchen table in front of her without comment. She had picked it up and read it and set it back down. That night she had written her first letter. She told herself she would tell Eli before she got there. She told herself this on the morning of April 15th, when the wagon company assembled at the edge of Independence, and she counted 22 wagons and tried to remember how to breathe. She told herself this crossing the Kansas prairie where the sky was so enormous it felt like a personal affront, where the wind came from the west carrying the smell of something she could not name. She told herself this through May when the mornings were still cold and her body was still small enough that a careful arrangement of her coat concealed what was happening beneath it. By June, concealment was no longer possible. The woman who found out first was a Mrs. Dora Pittman, traveling with her husband and 2 grown sons in a wagon 3 places behind Clara's. Dora Pittman was 51 years old, had delivered 9 children, and had the eyes of a woman who knew precisely what she was looking at. She came and sat beside Clara one evening at the fire near the South Platte crossing, somewhere around mile 600, and said without preamble, "How far along are you then?" It was not a question. Clara looked at the fire for a moment. Then she said, "Far enough." Dora Pittman nodded once, as if this confirmed something she had already decided. She said, "Is there a man at the end of this road who's expecting you?" Clara said, "Yes." "Does he know?" Clara said nothing. Dora Pittman sat with her for a while after that, not speaking, which Clara later thought might have been the single most merciful thing another person had done for her in the whole of 1862. Then she stood and brushed the grass off her skirt and said, "Well, what can't be fixed has to be carried. You seem like a woman who knows how to carry things." She walked back to her wagon, and Clara sat alone with the sound of the river and the fire and the cattle shifting in the dark, and she wrote in her diary, a small leather book she kept inside a flour sack inside her trunk, words she had not been able to say aloud to anyone. "I am going to Oregon, and I am going to have this child, and I am going to let a man I have never met decide what that means. I do not know what else there is to do. I am not sure there is anything else." The wagon company crossed the Platte at Beauvais Crossing on the 1st of June, a Sunday which the company captain noted in the log as a minor miracle. The river was running fast and brown from mountain snowmelt, and 3 wagons had to be double-teamed across. Clara sat in the bed of her wagon during the crossing with her hand pressed flat against the canvas above her and her eyes closed, listening to the sound of the water against the wheels and the shouting of the men on the bank. When the wagon lurched up onto solid ground on the far side, she exhaled so deeply that the young woman sharing her wagon, a newlywed named Harriet, asked if she was all right. Clara said she was fine. She was fine. At Fort Laramie, at mile 840, the company stopped for 3 days to rest the animals and make repairs. Clara walked the perimeter of the fort once each morning for the movement and sat in the afternoon in the thin shade of the wall and wrote letters she did not send, to her father, to her sisters, once to George Alderman, which she tore into pieces without reading back. She did not write to Eli. She had meant to. She had sat down with the paper and the pen 3 separate times. Each time she had written his name at the top, Mr. Harding, and then stared at what came next and found nothing that was true enough and survivable at the same time. In the end, she put the paper away and watched the soldiers cross the yard and told herself she would tell him in person. That telling him in a letter was cowardice. that telling him face to face was at least honest, even if everything that came before it had not been. She was not sure she believed this, but it was what she had. The company crossed South Pass on the 3rd of July, the Continental Divide at 7,412 feet, and she felt the wind change direction on the other side and thought, everything that drains from this point forward drains to the Pacific. She had never been west of Indiana. This struck her as a fact of an almost spiritual quality. By July, she had stopped trying to hide what she was carrying. There was no point. The company knew. Most of them said nothing. A few women had been quietly kind, leaving extra biscuits near her wagon, slowing their pace on the days when the heat was cruel, without comment or fanfare. Mrs. Bittman walked with her each evening when the company stopped, not talking, just walking. This, too, was a mercy. At Fort Hall, in present-day Idaho, the trail boss called a meeting. The Snake River crossing ahead was running high. He thought they should wait 2 days. 2 days became 4. It was August by then, the air smelling of sage and heat, and the nights were cold in a way that was not hostile, only businesslike. Clara lay in the wagon at night with her hands on the ark of her belly and thought about a porch that faced west and a man she had never met who had written her 7 careful letters and was already waiting somewhere at the end of this road. She thought about what his face would do. She could not decide what she was most afraid of. That he would be angry. That he would be cold. That he would be quietly, patiently kind and would send her back anyway. Because kindness and practicality are not the same thing, and a man who had advertised for a wife had not advertised for this. She thought about her father saying, "We will think of something." She thought, "I have thought of something. I am not sure it was the right thing." The Snake River crossing went badly for one wagon and well for the rest. Clara's wagon made it across in 8 minutes, the water climbing to the wheel hubs and no higher, and she sat rigid in the bed of it with her back against her trunk and did not make a sound. On the western bank, a company man named Collier, tall, who had barely spoken to her the entire journey, helped her down from the tailboard and said, simply, "Good crossing." She thanked him. He went back to his work. She stood on the far bank of the Snake River and looked back at the water, which was the color of iron in the afternoon light, and she thought, "I have crossed the river. Whatever comes next, I have crossed the river." The Blue Mountains nearly undid her, not because of the terrain, though the terrain was severe. The company reached them in early September, and the trail through the mountains was the steepest and roughest she had encountered, the wagons angled and grinding over rock, the animals straining, everyone who could walk walking to spare the wheels. But it was not the climbing that was hard. It was the waiting that came just before it. The company stopped at the base of the Blues for a day to prepare the wagons, and it was there, sitting on a log at the edge of a creek with her boots wet through from the morning crossing, that Clara wrote the last entry in her diary before Oregon City. She wrote it carefully, in the small, precise hand she had developed as a minister's daughter who had kept records. September 5th. We are at the foot of the mountains. I have come 1,900 miles, and I have not turned back, and I have not lied to him exactly, because I have not said a word to him about any of this. I do not know if the difference matters. I think it might not matter to him. I think I am about to find out what kind of man writes careful letters to a woman he has never met and comes to the road to wait for her. I am not sure what I am hoping for. I think I am hoping for mercy. I think that is all anyone ever really hopes for. She put the diary back in the flour sack. She helped 2 other women carry a chest across a muddy section of the trail. She ate cold cornbread for supper and slept without dreaming. 3 days later, the company came down the western slope of the Blues into the beginning of the Willamette Valley, and the air was different, softer, damper, with the smell of fur and something green and living, and Clara breathed it in and felt something in her chest that she did not expect. Not relief, not joy, but a recognition. As though her body knew before her mind did that this was the place. She arrived in Oregon City on the 24th of September, a Wednesday, 2 weeks ahead of the first frost. Eli said nothing for a long moment. He stood on the road and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and neither of them moved. The afternoon sun was low and direct, the way it gets in the valley in late September, and it was in both their faces. He had a face that was harder than his letters, she thought. Or not harder, more worn. The face of someone who had done more weather than he had expected. He said, "You must be tired." She said, "I am." He said, "My wagon is at the far end of the street. Can you walk that far?" She said she could. He did not offer her his arm. He walked beside her at a pace she could match, and he did not look at her belly again, not directly. And he did not say anything for the length of the street. She kept her eyes on the road and concentrated on the sound of her own breathing, which was the only thing she felt she could control. At the wagon, he helped her up onto the bench. His hand was on her elbow, steadying, and then gone. He walked around to the other side and climbed up and picked up the reins and started them moving, out of Oregon City and west toward the valley. They drove for 20 minutes without speaking. Then he said, "Is there something you want to tell me?" His voice was not angry. It was the voice of a man asking a question he already knew the answer to, and was giving her the chance to say it herself. She said yes. She told him then. Not everything, not George Alderman's name, not the letter that had arrived in July, not the particular quality of the silence in her father's house on the morning they had looked at the advertisement together, but the truth of it, that she was with child, that the man was gone, that she had not told him in her letters because she had not known how, and that she understood if he wanted to turn back to town right now and put her on the first wagon east. She kept her eyes on the valley road ahead while she spoke. When she finished, she kept them there. Eli said nothing for long enough that she counted the sound of the horse's hooves. 8, 9, 10. Then he said, "I built 2 chairs for the porch. I didn't know why I built 2. I'd been sitting in one for 3 years." She turned to look at him. His eyes were on the road. He said, "I don't know what the right thing is here. I'm not going to pretend I do. But I came to that road to meet a woman who was willing to work and wasn't afraid of distance, and everything I can see suggests you are both of those things considerably more than most." She did not say anything. He said, "We can talk about the rest of it. There's time." They drove the rest of the way to the farm without speaking again. But it was a different kind of silence than the one they had begun with. The valley in the late afternoon was the color of something she did not have a word for. Not gold, not green, something between the two, the light coming through the fir trees at a long angle and the creek audible before it was visible. He stopped the wagon in front of the house. It was exactly as he had described it, 2 rooms and a porch facing west. The 2 chairs were there, both of them going gray in the weather. She sat on the wagon bench and looked at the house for a moment. Then she climbed down, carefully, and stood in front of it. Behind her she heard him climb down and begin to unhitch the horse. He did not rush her. She was so tired she could feel it in her teeth. 2,000 miles of tired, the kind that does not resolve in 1 night or 10, but has to be paid back slowly, over seasons. She put her hand on the porch railing. The wood was rough under her palm, unpainted, the kind of wood that has been left to weather. She thought about her father's house in Millbrook, Ohio, which she would likely never see again. She thought about the first letter she had written on a November night. The lamp burning low, a life she could not yet see the shape of. She went up the 2 porch steps and through the door. The kitchen was clean. The table had been wiped. Someone had put a jar of dried wild flowers on the windowsill. The kind of gesture a person makes when they are hoping for something and will not say so. She sat down at the table, because she needed to sit. After a while, he came in and built up the fire without being asked, and put water on to boil, and asked her if she was hungry. She said she was. He made something simple, eggs and bread and a piece of cured pork that had been hanging in the cold room, and he set it in front of her, and sat across the table and ate his own supper without looking at her too much or too little. They did not talk about the future that night. There was, as he had said, time. The child was born on the 21st of November, 1862, during the first hard frost of the season. Eli rode for the neighbor woman, a Mrs. Calloway, who had some experience with such things, and sat in the barn with the horse for the 4 hours it took, and came in when called. It was a girl. Clara had not yet decided on a name. She was still thinking about it. Lying in the bed Ellie had given up for her. In the inner room of the house, with the window showing the gray light of a November morning and the sound of the frost-stiffened grass moving in the wind outside. Eli stood in the doorway. He looked at the child for a long time. He said, "My mother's name was Ruth." Clara looked at him. His face had the same expression it had worn on the road outside Abernethy's store. Not unreadable exactly, but held. A man who was deciding something privately and would say so when he was sure. She said, "Ruth is a good name." He nodded once. He went back to his work. They were married in March, when the valley was beginning again, the grass coming up along the creek, the firs shaking off the last of the cold. It was a small ceremony, just the Callaways and her father's letter read aloud, and Eli's hands, which were the hands of a farmer, rough and careful in equal measure. She had written to her father in October, the week after she arrived. She had told him everything, including the 2 chairs on the porch. Her father had written back in January, a letter that took 3 months to reach the valley. He had written, "I prayed for mercy for you, and it seems it was given in a form I did not expect, which is usually how mercy arrives." She read this letter sitting on the porch on a February afternoon. Ruth asleep in the crook of her left arm, the valley below the house bare and patient and waiting for spring. The creek was running high from rain. The 2 chairs were cold from sitting in winter air, but the sun was directly on her face, and she let it stay there. She had carried her father's last letter all the way from Ohio, the one he had written before she left, with the advertisement tucked inside it. She took it out now and read it again. "We will think of something." They had thought of something. She folded the letter and held it in her lap and looked at the valley, which was the place she had come 2,000 miles to reach, and which looked, in the way of places that have been long imagined, both exactly as she had pictured and nothing like it at all. Inside the house, she could hear Eli moving in the kitchen, the sound of the stove, a cup set on the table. She did not go in yet. She sat with the valley a little longer, with the letter in her lap and the child against her shoulder and the cold, clean smell of a February morning in Oregon. And she thought that this was not the life she had planned. She thought, most lives aren't. The sun stayed on her face a long time before it moved.